5 years ago, if I told you buyers would eventually be paying more than $2,500 per square foot in Lentor, back then, there was no MRT, no mall, no completed developments, just a master plan and a lot of questions. Fast forward to today, Lentor MRT is up and running, Lentor Modern is completed, and the mall is open. And more than 3,300 units have already been launched across the township. So here's the question. Have buyers already missed the Lentor story? Or is Lentor Gardens still worth looking at? Because personally, I think we are at a very interesting stage of Lentor's development. 5 years ago, people were asking,
Hey, will Lentor work?
Today, nobody is asking that anymore. The question today is, which project should I buy in Lentor? And that's a very different conversation. So in this video, let's break down the demand story, future supply, land prices, and whether Lentor Gardens still makes sense as an own stay or investment purchase. Now, before we even talk about Lentor Gardens, let's take a step back and look at why does Lentor even actually exist. So personally, I've always looked at Lentor as an extension of Ang Mo Kio. Think about it. Ang Mo Kio is one of Singapore's most mature estates. Great amenities, good schools, strong transport network. But there's one problem. There isn't much new private housing left. So, when someone living in Ang Mo Kio wants to upgrade, where do they go? When their kids grow up, when they need more space, when they want a condo but still want to stay near their parents, where do they go? For many of them, the answer is actually Lentor. And that's why I've never really viewed Lentor as a brand new township. To me, it's tapping into an existing demand pool that's already there. Now, here's what's interesting. Since 2021, we've seen project after project launch. Lentor Modern, Lentor Hills, Hillock Green, Lentoria, Lentor Mansion, Lentor Central, and now Lentor Gardens. And in total, we are talking about more than 3,300 units. That's not a small number. And yet, the market has actually absorbed almost everything. Today, you go to Hillock Green, there's only a handful of units left. Lentoria is also down to a small number of remaining units. So whenever someone tells me, hey, Lentor is oversupplied, I always ask them one simple question. If it's oversupplied, how did 3,300 units get absorbed? Because oversupply isn't about the number of units. Oversupply is when buyers stop buying, and that's not what we are seeing. What we are seeing is demand continuing to come into the township. And to me, that's one of the strongest signals that the Lentor story is actually real. Not because developers say so, not because agents say so, but because buyers have already voted with their wallets. Now, let's talk about something most buyers don't think about. What comes after Lentor Gardens? Because future supply matters, especially if you're planning to hold the property for 5 to 10 years. And if you study the master plan, there are still sites that can potentially be developed in the future. So does that mean the government is done selling land in Lentor? Personally, I don't think we know that yet. But honestly, I don't think that's the most important question. The better question is, how much future supply is coming? When is it coming? And at what kind of land price? Because those factors matter far more than simply knowing another plot exists. And that brings me to what I think is one of the most important points in today's review. Now, let me ask you a question. If I told you the next site sold in Lentor was almost 40% more expensive than Lentor Gardens, would that change the way you look at today's pricing? Because it definitely caught my attention. Kingsford bought Lentor Gardens site at about 920 PSF PPR. The next Lentor site, the one beside Lentor Modern, was sold at around 1278 PSF PPR. Now that's a 39% increase. And before anyone gets excited, I'm not saying future launch prices will be 39% higher. Property doesn't work that way. But what it does tell us is something important. future developers are starting from a much higher cost base. And that's where Lentor Gardens gets interesting, because future launches don't just create competition. Sometimes future launches help validate existing pricing. If future launches need to launch at a higher prices because of their land costs, then today's pricing may start looking a lot more reasonable. And that's why I think buyers should pay attention to this. Not because it's a guarantee of profit, but because it gives us a clue about where future pricing benchmarks are going to be headed. Now at this point, some of you might be thinking, hey Bernard, if I already like Lentor, why not just buy one of the other projects? And honestly, that's a very fair question, because that's exactly what we are going to talk about next. Why Lentor Gardens might actually be the sweet spot. Because today, buyers actually have quite a few options. So where does Lentor Gardens actually fit in? Personally, I think it sits in a very interesting position. Lentor Modern gives you the integrated development story, but you pay a premium for that convenience. Lentor Central is closer MRT, but it also sits on a much higher land cost. Lentor Gardens sits somewhere in between. You're not buying the first project, and you're not buying the most expensive site. What you're buying into is a township that's already proven itself. And I think that's a very important distinction. 5 years ago, buyers were taking a leap of faith. Today, buyers already have evidence. MRT already operating, mall open already, and the demand is already there. So, if you're not betting on whether Lentor works, you're deciding whether the pricing still makes sense. And that's a much easier question to answer. So let me be very clear. I'm not saying Lentor Gardens is going to be automatically the best project in Lentor. Every buyer is different. Every budget different. Some buyers will still prefer Lentor Modern because of the integrated development concept. Some buyers may prioritize MRT proximity. Others may prefer a different layout. And what I'm saying is, Lentor Gardens enters the market at a very interesting point in the township's evolution. The biggest risks have already been tested. Township no longer theoretical. It is real, and we are seeing buildings already in the process of building. And personally, I think that's one of the biggest advantages. By the way, if you found this analysis useful so far, do consider subscribing. I review most of the major launches in Singapore, and my goal is always the same. Not to tell you whether project is good or bad, but to help you understand whether it actually makes sense. Because a good project at the wrong price can still be a bad investment. And a less exciting project at the right price can actually sometimes outperform. So if that's the type of content you enjoy, please do consider subscribing. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. Oversupply. Whenever I mention Lentor, this is probably the most common question I get. Hey Bernard, aren't there too many condos or not? And honestly, if you look at the map, I can understand why people feel that way. Because there are quite a few developments within a relatively small area. But let's think about it logically. Oversupply isn't about counting condos. Oversupply is when demand cannot absorb supply. These are two very different things. And when I look at Lentor today, I don't see any evidence of oversupply. I see evidence of absorption. Out of all the launches, 3,003 units have already been launched, and most of them sold. Now that's not what oversupply normally looks like. Now, could the future supply then become an issue? Of course, that's always possible. But I think buyers should focus on actual market behavior rather than assumptions. And that's where the completion timeline becomes very important. Now, before I show you this chart, let me ask you a question. If you're worried about oversupply, which year you think is the riskiest year? Most people assume everything is completing together. And that's usually where the concern comes from. Thousands of units, one township, lots of competition. But let's look at the actual timeline. Lentor Modern already TOP'd. Lentor Hillock Green are expected around 2027. Lentor Hills, Lentor Mansion, Lentor Central all around 2028. And Lentor Gardens, we are going to be TOPing at about 2030. Now, why does this matter? Because supply is entering the market gradually, not at once. If all 3,300 units were collecting keys in the same year, wow, then I'd probably be a lot more concerned. But that's not what's actually happening. Instead, each project gets a chance to establish its own resale market before the next project comes along. And by the time Lentor Gardens TOP, buyers already have several years of resale data to study. And that's important because earlier projects are effectively doing the hard work of price discovery. They're helping establish future benchmarks. And that's a very different story from oversupply. Now let's look at actual evidence, because at the end of the day, transactions matter more than opinions. One transaction that really caught my attention recently was a 990 square foot 3-bedroom unit on the 22nd floor of Lentor Modern. Transaction at approximately 2,517 PSF. Now think about that for a moment. The buyer is paying 2,570, isn't buying a future MRT. They are not buying a future mall. They are not buying a future township. What they are buying is already a completed product. Something they can already see, experience, and already compare against other developments. And yet, they're still willing to pay 2,005 PSF. To me, that's one of the strongest signals in the entire Lentor story. Because the market has already assigned a value to Lentor as a place people genuinely want to live, not as a future idea, not as a transformation story, but as a real residential destination. And that's a very different conversation from the one we were having 5 years ago. So where is the next wave of demand going to be coming from? Now, let's assume for a moment that demand for Lentor is real. And let's assume the township already proven itself. Then the next question I always ask is this: who's going to be the next buyer? Because at the end of the day, property prices only go up if someone is willing to pay more than you in the future. So who exactly is going to be buying all these units? Because let's be honest, 3,300 units is not a small number. And yet, the market has absorbed them remarkably well. And personally, I think the answer is actually quite straightforward. Ang Mo Kio. Think about it. There are very few opportunities for new private housing in Ang Mo Kio today. So when somebody living in Ang Mo Kio wants to upgrade, but stay near their parents, hey, where do they go? When their kids already studying nearby, where they go? When they spend the last 20 years living in this part of Singapore and don't want to relocate across the island, where do they go? For many of them, Lentor then becomes one of the most obvious answers. And that's why I think Lentor's demand story is different from some completely new growth areas. You're not creating a new demand pool. You're tapping into actually an existing one. And to me, that's one of the strongest parts of the investment thesis. Because when I ask myself who the future buyer is, I actually don't struggle to find an answer. Now let's talk about something that I think is equally important: unit selection. Because in a township with this many comparable projects, choosing the right unit becomes even more important than choosing the right project. Think about it. A buyer looking at Lentor Gardens isn't just going to compare Lentor against another location. They're comparing Lentor Gardens against all the other developments in the area. So not every stack is going to perform equally. And not every facing is going to perform equally. And that's why I think buyers need to be a little bit more selective. When I first studied the site plan, one thing immediately stood out. There are essentially two camps: north-facing and south-facing stacks. Now, most buyers will probably gravitate towards the north-facing units first. And honestly, I understand why. They're going to be facing the Hillock Park. You get greenery, you get openness, you get a more premium look. And if you look at the site plan, you actually notice something interesting. Many of the larger 4-bedroom units are actually positioned on this side. Personally, I don't think that's a coincidence. Developers understand that family buyers value views, privacy, and livability. So naturally, many of the premium layouts are concentrated on the premium facing. Now here's the question: will the developer load pricing onto those stacks? I think there's actually a good chance that they will. And that's where buyers will need to be careful, because sometimes the most popular stack isn't necessarily the best buy. Personally, I think the south-facing units deserve a much closer look. And here's why. Firstly, many of these units enjoy views towards the facilities and the pool. The pool is actually very nice. Secondly, beyond the future plot, you are actually looking towards landed housing. Now, this is important because the plot directly in front carries a plot ratio of only about 1.4, which means future buildings there should be significantly lower than many of the other plots within Lentor. So if you're on a higher floor, especially from around level 7 onwards, there's a good chance you'll continue enjoying a relatively open outlook. And here's something else. When Kingsford first bought this site, one of the biggest criticisms was the industrial buildings nearby. I remember seeing comments everywhere, too near industrial, very bad location. But when you actually study the site planning, you'll notice that the project has been orientated towards the landed housing, not towards the industrial buildings. So in other words, developer has deliberately positioned the project to maximize the better views. And I think that's something buyers should pay attention to, because if the pricing gap between the north-facing and the south-facing stacks becomes too wide, the south-facing units could actually end up offering much better value. Now let's talk about the unit type that caught my attention immediately, the 3-bedroom compact. And you know, over the last year, one trend has become very obvious. Buyers are becoming increasingly sensitive to quantum, not PSF, quantum. People are still buying, but they want a manageable entry price. And I think that's where the 3-bedroom compact is going to be one of the most competitive units in the entire project. And what surprised me wasn't the layout, it was the supply. There's only one stack, 15 units. That's it. 15 units in a 499 unit development. Now think about it. Who wants these units? Young families, HDB upgraders, buyers looking for a practical 3-bedroom layout. And all of them are competing for the same 15 units. So if this is your target unit type, your queue number is going to matter a lot. Now before I give my final verdict, let's summarize everything we've discussed. Reason number 1, more than 3,300 units have already been absorbed. Demand already proven one. Reason number 2, Lentor Modern is already establishing resale benchmarks above 2,500 per square foot. The latest transaction that caught my attention was approximately 2,517 per square foot. Reason number 3, Kingsford bought this site for around $920 PSF PPR. The next site sold at around 1,278 PSF PPR. Now, that's a significantly higher cost base for future developers. Reason number 4, Lentor Gardens is one of the later projects expected to TOP within the township, which means earlier projects have time to establish resale benchmarks before Lentor Gardens completes. And finally, reason number 5, the township already proven itself. MRT operating, mall operating, infrastructure is already in place. So you're not buying a future vision anymore. You're buying into something that's already working. So after looking at the demand story, the future supply story, land prices, resale market, unit selection strategy, would I seriously consider Lentor Gardens? My answer is yes. Not because it's the cheapest project, not because it's the most exciting project, but because I think it sits at a very interesting point in the evolution of Lentor. 5 years ago, buying Lentor required faith. You're buying into a master plan, a future MRT, future shopping mall, and a future township. Today, buying Lentor requires analysis. MRT already there, mall already there, residents are already staying there, and the resale market is already forming. So the whole township story has already largely been written. The question now is whether today's pricing still makes sense when Lentor reaches full maturity. And that's something every buyer needs to decide for themselves. If you've enjoyed today's review, do remember to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who's considering Lentor Gardens. And if you like a personalized discussion on whether this project fits into your plans, feel free to reach out. My name is Bernard Tan. I help you plan your next move properly because the right move isn't just about property, it's about planning. I'll see you at the next one.